My name's Sammy Roth. I'm a journalist and climate storyteller. I was at the LA Times for a long time, and now I write a newsletter called Climate Colored Goggles, which I'll put the link to in the chat in a minute if I can help it. Sean asked me to talk about some of the my favorite climate stories that I've told over the last year or two, and I was looking back through the stories, and a lot of them were unsurprisingly kind of bleak. So I have tried to pick out a few of the stories that have given me some level of hope, especially in the energy realm. Because there's definitely some good ones. I want to start with one that actually just came up last week, and that I think fits with the theme of this retreat. I've done quite a bit of reporting over the last, gosh, probably going back almost a decade now, on gas stoves and home electrification, probably an area a lot of folks here are familiar with. It's pretty well established at this point, not only that home electrification and building electrification writ large is central to climate progress, but also that cooking with gas is a huge air quality problem. I mean, there's been a really substantial amount of research, even though the gas industry has tried to cover it up, going back decades now, as various reporters and researchers have established, looking at nitrogen dioxide emissions and looking at benzene emissions. More is coming out all the time, but it's pretty well established that there are links between gas cooking and asthma development in children and exacerbation of asthma in children and adults, and very substantial amounts of premature death. So, it's unfortunately, as a journalist, it's one of these things where you sort of become inured to it, where more research comes out, more reporting comes out, and you start to think, okay, I kind of already knew that. So a new study did come out a couple weeks ago that really made me stop and go, "Wow, this is a big deal, and actually this is kind of hopeful." There was a study that was published, and I'll put the link in the chat to the piece I did about it, that came out of Case Western Reserve University, where with funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, you had a team of researchers working in suburbs that actually went and installed induction cooktops in um, 91 homes. They were supposed to do 1,200 homes, which would have been incredible, but the Trump administration immediately cut off the funding as soon as they could. They were supposed to have $17 million. The funds were finalized at the very end of the Biden administration. Trump took over and cut off most of the funding. So they ended up getting to 91 homes in disadvantaged communities in and around Cleveland. 91 homes where at least one person was suffering from asthma. And then what they did after they installed the induction cooktops, well, so first they went to 72 homes where at least one person suffered from poorly controlled asthma. And before they put the induction cooktops in, they measured health outcomes for the people in these homes with these poorly controlled asthma cases. And they asked them things like, kind of these standard asthma questionnaire questions. How often were you awoken at night by your asthma? How often were you wheezing? And then stuff like, did you have to go to the hospital? Did you miss days of school or work, et cetera? So they measured asthma outcomes before the induction cooktops, and then they measured the asthma health outcomes after the induction cooktops went in, after they got the gas out of the kitchen. Um, they kind of thought, these researchers, and I interviewed the lead scientist on the study, Ash Siegel, a professor at Case Western. They kind of thought that after the Trump administration cut off most of the funding and the sample size went way down, that the signal would not be very strong if indeed they found a signal, just because, 91 homes instead of 1,200. Lo and behold, they found an incredibly strong signal. They found that not only did health outcomes improve across every metric that they studied in these patients with poorly controlled asthma, but they found that they found twice as much improvement in health outcomes as you would typically see with standard asthma treatments. And when I was tipped off to this study, which was getting very little media attention, I just was like, oh my God, twice as much health improvement. The number here, I've got it in a separate window on my screen. There's this asthma metric where you have this sliding scale, and patients before the study said that they had a 2.6 average on the scale, which indicates moderate asthma symptoms. Afterwards, they were down to 1.5 on average, which is mild asthma symptoms, which is a 1.1 point improvement. The comparison is that for, typical medical treatment of asthma, you see between zero point 0.4 and zero point 0.6 points of improvement on this scale. By getting gas out of the kitchen and putting electric induction cooktops in, you got 1.1 points of improvement, so about double. The headline that I wrote on this story, which generated a lot of attention, and I think was, reasonably accurate. Researchers used electric stoves to treat asthma. It worked. Um, Again, did this really tell us anything new? It's pretty logical to think that taking gas out of the kitchen would make people feel better and healthier. Like, no, I mean, I think the researchers kind of expected this. Still pretty amazing to see, and I think hopeful. The caveats here, again, still a relatively small sample size. There's more variables that need to be studied here. They would have loved to have had that other $15 million to, do further follow-up testing. It was one sort of small control group. So there's a lot of, additional research and study to be done. But, I talked to some other experts. I looked at the caveats in the study, and it seemed quite robust and lines up with a lot of what's already known. And it's relevant because there are a lot of laws that are different states are either passing or beginning to pass right now about putting warning labels on gas stoves, health warning labels. There's a law that Colorado passed that is now being litigated because gas appliance manufacturers are suing to try to block it. The New York State legislature has passed a law that is sitting on Governor Hochul's desk in New York right now, so we'll see if she signed that. A few other similar bills have been proposed in other states. And in California, actually, this law was passed a few years ago, but Gavin Newsom vetoed it. So this is, a really active and live area of debate among the states. So, the more evidence and the more science that gets done in this area, the better, sort of the clearer picture we get. So that is one of my favorite stories that I've gotten to do recently because it was just so, so interesting and so relevant and so, so hopeful to see that the health outcomes can improve like that. Um, Similar related note on clean energy at the household level, I have been reporting a lot on balcony solar, which again is a topic that I imagine a lot of folks here are familiar with, and again, an area where there's a lot of legislation that's taking place. I was just before this call looking at the bill in the California legislature. So there are someone in the comments. I love balcony solar, so great. So there's some familiarity here. Last I checked, and I am a couple weeks behind on this, but there are 8 states that have already passed plug-in solar laws. So forgive me if I'm not 100% up to date on that. It started in Utah. It's kind of this incredible story where, you think deep red Utah, not a big fan of renewable energy, but there was a state legislator in Utah who read a New York Times article. Oh, someone's asking for a link. So I did put the link to my first story in, but I'll put a link to the balcony solar one that I wrote in June here. The Utah balcony solar started to take off after a state legislator in Utah read a New York Times article about how in Europe, balcony solar was taking off in response to just, global energy market shocks and people wanting to have more, lower electricity bills and more control over their energy destiny. Um, and this guy in Utah was encouraged by it and kind of inspired by it and said, I want that for my constituents in my state. It wasn't it wasn't partisan. It wasn't a Democrat versus Republican thing. It just felt free market and logical and democratic to him in the small d democratic sense. So he got Utah to pass this law, and since then it's taken off across the country. For those who may not be familiar, it's a pretty simple concept. You hang solar panels literally from your balcony and plug them in, or maybe prop them up in your backyard. The big question that has kind of been bedeviling balcony solar or plug-in solar in the United States is whether you require a utility interconnection agreement for safety reasons. It's kind of a legal gray area right now. There are companies that are, selling these panels and offering these services, even though in some states it's unclear whether you need utility interconnection. So there are laws that are being proposed and in some places passed to clarify that if UL safety standards are in place, that you don't need utility interconnection, which, creates long delays and additional costs, clarifying that again, as long as the panels are certified by UL, you can just go and do it yourself. So the place where this is in California right now is that there is a bill that has passed the state Senate overwhelmingly. Um, the vote was 35 to 1 in the yeah, that was the state Senate. In the Assembly, it passed the Energy Committee on a, I believe, unanimous vote. It's now sitting at the Appropriations Committee in the California Assembly, which is unfortunately a place where a lot of bills do die, and it's been sitting there kind of waiting for a hearing. It's a fight, as frequently happens with small scale solar, between the utilities and a lot of environmental advocates. At the moment, Southern California Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric are opposed unless there are amendments to the bill. There have also been questions from a lot of the electrical worker unions about safety, which, from what I can tell, there doesn't seem to be that big a safety issue, but there's concern that's been raised about that. And also the municipal utilities, in addition to the investor-owned utilities, seem pretty fiercely opposed. So again, a lot of states are doing this. It would be pretty weird if California was, was behind. But to be seen if it makes it out of the legislature and gets signed by Gavin Newsom. Tom Steyer, who of course was running for governor, was a big fan and expressed that. So far, I haven't seen anything from Javier Becerra on it. So we'll see what happens on that one, but certainly a hopeful trend taking place across the country and something I've been excited to follow. Yes, thank you for pointing that out in the chat. It's Senate Bill 868, and that's referenced in my story also. Another story that I've been following with great interest and I've enjoyed covering. This is one that's going to seem like obvious and like why is this still relevant, but that I think is pretty important is the end of coal in California, which maybe if you haven't been following, like, didn't coal end in California a long time ago? No, surprisingly, coal just died in California finally in December of this year, or maybe it was it was actually the end of November. Um, for the last like 40 years, the largest electricity source in Los Angeles for a long time was the Intermountain Power Plant, a coal plant in Utah that opened in the 1980s that supplied LA and Pasadena and Burbank and a bunch of other cities in Southern California that was built explicitly for them. They, built it as far away as possible, didn't have to deal with the pollution. As recently as like 2007, coal was almost half of LA's power, which is kind of crazy. And this was like the last gasp of coal in California. LA had been planning to shut this thing down for like 10, 15 years. It took them forever to finally get there. But it finally happened. I was up there got it outside this little town called Delta, Utah, which has a few thousand people in it. It's interesting because Delta, Utah, I mean, the whole economy of this place is this coal plant. So for the folks up there going to meet them and, sort of understand what's happening on the other side of the power line, you do sort of realize you get to understand a little better why it is that as terrible as coal is for the climate and for the air and et cetera, why it is that there's, so much sort of fierce opposition to shutting stuff down because they're wondering what's going to happen to them. It's their entire tax base. It's most of the jobs in town. There's been a lot of controversy in Los Angeles about the city's plans to build a new green hydrogen plant to replace the coal plant. Because, is that really a realistic clean energy solution or something that we should be investing in? For the folks up in Utah, they're thrilled about that because they, want and need something to invigorate their economy. So it'll be interesting to see if that works out or if it lands Los Angeles with, a stranded asset if green hydrogen doesn't work out and they're stuck investing in gas that they then need to shut down by the 2045 deadline. But the bright story here is that it took forever, but finally the last coal plant that was directly supplying electricity to Los Angeles, finally in late 2025 met its end, which is a really big deal and something that was kind of long overdue. And I think I have not put the story in the chat yet here, so I'm going to do that. If you want to get really technical, there are a couple of there's like a small co-op in Riverside County that's getting a little coal from Arizona and Pacific Power up in far northern California that still has some out-of-state coal, but that's like 0.2% of the state's electricity. This was the last one that was even a couple of percentage points. So California is as of 2025 finally off of coal, bucking the trend of whatever Trump is trying to do. couple more stories that I've been really excited to report over the last year or two that are kind of moving away from like this sort of strict wonky energy angles here, but that I think are still relevant to this conversation. So one of the reasons I left the LA Times to start this newsletter, Climate Colored Goggles, was because I got really interested in um, what are the sort of cultural forces that are informing what people think about energy, how opinions form, and sort of what is underlying policy and politics. How do we get to the point where certain policies and certain politics are possible and not? So I started to think a lot about entertainment. I started to think a lot about sports. I started to think a lot about social media algorithms and how that gets us to a place where, it is or isn't possible, say, to, pass a bill like polluters pay in the California legislature, or to, pass a bill like, balcony solar, for instance. One of the things that I got really interested in my last couple of years at the Times was fossil fuel advertising, and fossil fuel advertising in sports in particular, because sports is probably the strongest cultural force in the United States. I'm a big LA Dodgers fan. I'm from Los Angeles, and it took me a really long time to realize, no matter how many Dodgers games I was going to, that the most ubiquitous advertisement in that stadium was for an oil company, for 76 gasoline. If you've been to a Dodgers game or even a Giants game now, because they advertise in San Francisco too, if you've seen those big orange and blue 76 logos, that's 76 Gas. They're a brand that's owned by Phillips 66, which until recently operated one of the major oil refineries in California. They were the one in the LA area that closed last year. That is, one of the two big ones that closed. That's been causing this sort of mini crisis where the legislature has been scrambling to permit new oil drilling. But anyway, I started to think about, okay, what does oil advertising in sports and in other industries mean, and how does this sort of shape how people form their opinions about oil and gas in California? So I started to write about should sports teams be taking money from the fossil fuel industry. And what ended up happening was that a sort of climate campaign, a couple of activist groups, the Sierra Club and others, got together after I wrote this story and started a petition, which ended up getting 28 or 29,000 signatures calling on the Dodgers to drop Phillips 66 as an advertiser. They started holding protests at Dodger Stadium. Um, the Senate president, the majority leader, not the Senate president, the majority leader of the California Senate at the time, Lena Gonzalez, ended up writing a letter to the ownership of the Dodgers, telling them that they should drop Phillips 66 as an advertiser. She was also one of the authors of the polluters pay bills that hasn't made any progress in California. Um, and I'm getting to the actual story here that I'm going to share. One of the things I've realized over the course of all of this reporting about fossil fuel advertisements in sports is that one, it's quite ubiquitous. UCLA ended up doing a study, or an analysis, I should say, as a result of some of my reporting, that there are actually 60 franchises across North American major professional sports leagues, at least 60. They were able to count 60, that take sponsorships from oil and gas companies or from utilities that are majority fossil fueled, which was quite interesting to me. The other thing I realized was that there are very few athletes that are willing to speak out about this, or that are speaking out about climate much at all in the United States. It's much more common in Europe. There are a few groups of athletes in the United States, eco athletes, Protect Our Winters, where you have folks who are talking about, heat waves and winters that aren't as snowy, and how the Olympics are being affected. The United States, as is frequently the case on climate, is much behind Europe here, where it's very, very common for tennis players and soccer players and variety of sports, winter athletes to be, very frequently talking about, here's how our experiences are being affected by climate. We don't want our teams to be sponsored by fossil fuel companies, et cetera. Yes, someone mentioning in the chat, Ted Lasso has a great episode about this, which is funny because I almost didn't even remember the Ted Lasso episode when I started reporting this stuff, where the team actually covers up the oil company advertisements on its jersey. That's fantastic. The story that I ended up doing a couple weeks ago here, gosh, when was this? About 2 months ago, which I'm going to drop in the chat. For the first time, I was able to connect with a Major League Baseball player, a pitcher for the Angels named Brent Suter, who's a member of the group Eco Athletes, who spoke with me about his discomfort with oil and gas advertising in sports, which was quite powerful for someone employed by a Major League Baseball team. With this, talking about anything political, let alone climate, let alone the advertisers for these teams. Um, to go on the record about this and express his unhappiness with it. It was quite amazing. He was careful not to say explicitly, I hate these companies. I would never play for a team that, was sponsored by one of these companies. But he said he'd much prefer to play for teams that are sponsored by clean energy companies. He really focused on how he thinks that more, clean energy companies should get in the game here and try to displace the fossil fuel companies. I did ask him explicitly, would you play for one of the three baseball teams that has oil industry patches on their jerseys? Because there are actually the Cleveland Guardians, the Texas Rangers, and the Houston Astros all have oil company, like literal patches on their jersey sleeves as sponsors. And he thought about it and he said, I don't know, I haven't been approached by any of those teams in free agency, so he didn't really answer the question. So to have a Major League Baseball player, sort of be the first through the gate to go out on that on the record, that was a story I was very excited to tell, and I think is the kind of moment that hopefully there will be more to follow and create some more social pressure on that front. And I see someone mentioned in the comments here that FIFA being owned by oil is crazy. I will try to bring up the link here. Um, it is crazy, and I did a whole another story a couple of weeks ago about how Saudi Aramco, the major state-owned Saudi oil company, is like one of the major, if not the main sponsor of FIFA, and has cultivated this incredibly close relationship with, not only with Trump, which is well known, but with just global soccer. They're paying like $100 million a year to have their name on every, soccer match that people are. Oh, thanks, John, for putting that in there too. Um, so there's a, super close relationship between the fossil fuel industry and sports. One last story that I'll mention here before turning things over, just to sort of finally try to drill in the point that there's good stuff happening in the world. For all of the bad billionaires out there who are in the news all the time, and I've done more stories than I wished I had to on bad billionaires in the energy space. When Ted Turner passed away a few months ago, I was very pleasantly surprised to learn about all of the interesting work that Ted Turner had done, not only in conservation and public lands or land conservation, but in renewable energy. I don't know how many folks here will be familiar with this because I certainly was not until right around the time he passed away. But this is the guy who founded CNN and also, on a baseball note, owned the Atlanta Braves for a while. It turned out he was one of the largest private landowners in America, had owned 2 million acres, made huge contributions to bison conservation. He had like the largest private bison herd in the United States. He was doing all of this incredible work to restore Rio Grande cutthroat trout populations and endangered tortoises all over Colorado and New Mexico and other states. I ended up spending a lot of time talking to folks who worked for his foundation just about how he was, really just using most of his wealth near the end of his life to support these causes. And one of the incredible finds that I made while working on this story, and despite having spent a dozen years writing about energy, I had no idea that in the sort of early days of the large-scale solar industry, he had founded what seems like it was a somewhat foundational renewable energy company called Turner Renewable Energy, which was an early acquisition that First Solar made in 2007 that helped First Solar grow its business pretty significantly. And that Turner had also made investments in foundations that were supporting energy efficiency policy at the state level. That his foundation was, you know, supporting programs to, build support for renewable energy on an economic basis. It was just quite impressive and quite cool to learn about all of the work that he had done very quietly and behind the scenes, which is not how billionaires normally operate. So those are some of my favorite climate stories from 2025 and 2026. Appreciate Sean giving me the chance to talk about some of this stuff. And I will turn it back over for the next speaker.